James Garner was not the kind of man to start fights. He had a reputation in Hollywood for being calm, professional, and deeply respected by almost everyone he worked with. He was the kind of actor who showed up on time, knew his lines, and treated everyone from the lighting guy to the director with decency and kindness. So when he voiced concern about someone, people should have listened. But they didn't. There was one actress, elegant, iconic, a legend in her own right, that Garner warned others about behind closed doors. He made it clear there was something about her that just did not sit right, and for years people dismissed him. After all, she had charmed the press, won over fans, and built a career on being bold, sophisticated, and impossible to ignore. On the surface, she was everything Hollywood adored. But James Garner had seen a different side of her, one that rarely slipped through the cracks. Once it did, it changed everything. Only years later did the stories begin to surface from other actors, directors, even crew members. And suddenly Garner's quiet warning didn't seem so outlandish anymore. In fact, it started to look like he had been right all along. So what exactly happened between James Garner and this untouchable icon? What did he see that made him speak up? And why did it take Hollywood so long to finally believe him? To understand why James Garner's warning was so surprising and so easy to ignore, you have to understand who she was to the world. Lauren Bacall was not just any actress. She was Hollywood royalty. From the moment she appeared on screen in the 1940s with that low, smoky voice and those famously arched eyebrows, she redefined what it meant to be cool, confident, and completely in control. She made her debut opposite Humphrey Bogart in To Have and Have Not, and from there, everything changed. Their chemistry was electric both on screen and off. And Bacall quickly became more than just a rising star. She became a symbol of glamour, strength, and mystery. Critics adored her, studios respected her, and fans idolized her. In a business obsessed with youth and obedience, Bacall stood out for her sharp wit, her backbone, and her unwillingness to play by anyone's rules but her own. She moved through the industry with a kind of magnetic force, earning a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense woman who knew exactly what she wanted and usually got it. Interviews painted her as fiercely intelligent and refreshingly honest. She spoke her mind, challenged norms, and refused to be pigeonholed into playing damsels or sidekicks. For many, she was a feminist icon before the phrase had even caught on, but behind all that charm and polish, there were whispers, the kind that never made it into magazine spreads or televised interviews. People who worked with her sometimes described her as cold, controlling, even condescending. It wasn't something you would hear from her fans or see in her performances, but in private circles, her name came with a quiet warning. And yet when those whispers surfaced, they were brushed aside because Lauren Bacall was, well, Lauren Bacall. She had built her entire identity on being fearless and unapologetic. To some, her confidence was inspiring. To others, including one very respected actor, it was something else entirely. James Garner saw the difference. He felt it. And once they worked together, he couldn't keep it to himself. By the time Lauren Bacall and James Garner found themselves on the same project, both were already icons. Garner had risen to fame through his effortless charm in Maverick and cemented his status with the Rockford Files. He was the guy everyone liked, calm, easygoing, with a dry wit that disarmed even the toughest personalities. He treated everyone on set with respect, from directors to extras. In a town full of ego, Garner was grounded. Then came The Fan, a psychological thriller released in 1981, starring Bacall as a Broadway star stalked by an obsessive admirer, with Garner cast as her ex-husband. It should have been a smooth collaboration between two seasoned pros. But almost from the moment production began, Garner sensed something was off. According to people close to the production, the tension between the two wasn't explosive. It was subtle. Cold, professional on the surface, but underneath, there was a quiet friction that was impossible to ignore. Garner was used to sets that felt like families. Bacall brought something different. She was precise, demanding, and at times dismissive of those who didn't meet her standards or who challenged her control. She didn't yell, but her energy could fill a room in a way that kept everyone on edge. Garner, for his part, never tried to upstage her or get into power struggles. That wasn't his style. But he also didn't pretend when something wasn't working. Bacall, it seemed, had little interest in adjusting her approach for the sake of harmony. She knew her status, and she made sure everyone else did too. Behind closed doors, some crew members began to talk. There were mutterings about Bacall rewriting lines on set or questioning the director's authority during blocking. Garner, though reluctant to stir things up, found himself growing increasingly frustrated, not because he needed special treatment, but because the work itself was suffering. He would later hint at how unpleasant the experience had been without naming names outright. But those who knew him and knew the set understood exactly who he was referring to. Bacall's attitude had left a mark not just on him, but on several others involved in the film. What made it even more uncomfortable was that Bacall didn't see the problem. From her perspective, she was simply being direct, professional, and efficient. But to Garner, it was something very different. He had worked with all kinds of people throughout his career, bold, shy, eccentric, strong-willed, but what he saw in Bacall wasn't confidence. It was control, and not the kind that earns respect, but the kind that pushes people away. Still, Garner kept most of it to himself for the time being. But he wouldn't stay silent forever. James Garner was never known for throwing people under the bus. He was private, respectful, and almost allergic to gossip. So when he did speak up about someone, even vaguely, it meant something. And when he finally shared his thoughts about Lauren Bacall years after their work together on The Fan, his words were pointed. In his memoir, The Garner Files, he never launched a full-blown attack on Bacall. That wasn't his way. But he made it clear that their experience together had been, in his words, difficult. He described her as sharp and guarded, with a tendency to look down on those around her. He didn't name names or lay out accusations, but it was obvious her behavior had left a lasting and not positive impression. He recounted that working with her was like walking on eggshells. She expected things to go her way and had no patience for compromise. Garner, who valued collaboration and kindness, found her approach draining. What bothered him most wasn't just her demeanor, it was how easily others excused it. Because of her legacy, her beauty, and her status, people overlooked what was happening right in front of them. And in Hollywood, that was nothing new. There's a long history of powerful personalities being forgiven for behavior that would never be tolerated from anyone else, especially when that person has a golden age resume and a decades-long list of adoring fans. Garner's remarks didn't spark headlines or backlash. In fact, most people glossed over them. Bacall was a legend after all. She had worked with the best, married Humphrey Bogart, and built an entire career on being bold and unapologetic. If anyone complained about her, it was often seen as a sign of weakness or jealousy. But Garner had nothing to prove. He wasn't bitter. He had no agenda. He was simply telling the truth the way he always had, plainly and honestly. And maybe that was why it was so easy to miss. He wasn't shouting from rooftops or leaking stories to the press. He was just quietly warning the next person in line, hoping they'd have a smoother experience than he did. Unfortunately, most people didn't take that warning seriously. And they probably should have, because once the story started piling up, it became clear Garner hadn't been alone. Most people remember The Fan as a modest thriller, stylish, eerie, and bolstered by Lauren Bacall's commanding presence. But what the public never saw was the tension simmering just out of frame. While the cameras rolled, something far less glamorous was unfolding behind them. James Garner, a seasoned actor who had worked with everyone from Julie Andrews to Steve McQueen, was rarely rattled by co-stars. But on the set of The Fan, he found himself walking a tightrope. Bacall, though never overtly hostile, created an atmosphere that made the entire set feel tense. Conversations were clipped, instructions turned into commands, and for those who tried to offer ideas or suggestions, especially if they challenged her authority, the response was often dismissive or icy. Crew members later described a dynamic that was hard to ignore. Bacall demanded control not just over her scenes, but over the energy of the production itself. She questioned direction, pushed back against rewrites, and was known to overrule decisions she felt didn't suit her vision. Garner, who valued harmony and efficiency, kept his frustration mostly to himself. But his body language and brief remarks told a different story. At one point, there were murmurs about a disagreement between Bacall and the film's director, Edward Bianchi. The details were never made public, but insiders hinted that Bacall's insistence on doing things her way slowed production and created rifts among the team. Garner, always professional, did his best to stay neutral, but it was obvious he was not enjoying himself. What made it more complex was Bacall's ability to turn the charm on and off like a switch. To the press, she was confident and witty. To the cast and crew, she could be critical, controlling, and detached. Garner once described working with someone like that as being in a cold room where the thermostat never changes. It wasn't a fiery clash. It was the quiet kind that wears people down over time. These weren't dramatic blow-ups caught on camera or published in gossip columns. They were smaller moments, snubs, silences, and sideways comments that painted a clear picture of what was happening. And they were the kind of clashes that rarely make headlines, but never go unnoticed by those who lived through them. For Garner, the experience was a lesson. Sometimes it isn't the loudest conflicts that leave the deepest impression, it's the quiet ones. And as he would soon discover, he was not the only one who had felt that chill. James Garner was not the only one who walked away from Lauren Bacall feeling uneasy. Over the years, several actors and insiders quietly echoed similar sentiments, stories that rarely made headlines but circulated in dressing rooms, green rooms, and private conversations. One of the most telling patterns was how Bacall handled other strong personalities. She wasn't intimidated by anyone, and she made that very clear. While some admired her confidence, others found it aggressive, even combative. On stage, particularly during her Broadway years, Bacall was known for pushing boundaries with directors and clashing with co-stars who didn't match her intensity. According to theater insiders, there were productions where rehearsals grew tense, not because of inexperience or creative differences, but because Bacall insisted on running the show her way. Even veteran performers felt the heat. One actor who had starred in a revival alongside her reportedly walked off the production midway, citing irreconcilable creative differences, a phrase that often masks much deeper personal conflict. Rumors swirled that Bacall's need for control had turned collaboration into a battlefield. Though the incident was never publicly confirmed, it added to the quiet mythology surrounding her behind-the-scenes persona. Actress Brenda Vaccaro, who worked in similar circles, once hinted in an interview that Bacall could be impossible to please when things didn't revolve around her. While she never named names, the timing and context made it clear who she meant. Even those who admired Bacall's talent privately admitted that working with her could be exhausting. She was brilliant, one anonymous stage actor recalled, but she had a way of making the air feel thinner when she walked in. Then there was the matter of longtime friends who had become distant colleagues. Some of Bacall's closest industry relationships eventually faded, not because of scandal or betrayal, but simply because the emotional cost of staying close became too high. She could be loyal, yes, but also demanding, controlling, and fiercely critical. One friend from her early days described her as the kind of person who remembered every slight, no matter how small, and never let you forget it either. Even her interviews reflected this guarded edge. Bacall often spoke of honesty, but it was a selective honesty. She was quick to critique others, especially fellow actresses, once telling a reporter that most of them never had to fight as hard as I did. It was a revealing comment, not just about her worldview, but about how she measured others. For Bacall, respect had to be earned the hard way, and even then, it wasn't always freely given. When you look at these accounts together, the stage tensions, the strained friendships, the quiet comments from actors who had been through it, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Garner was not a lone voice. He was part of a quiet chorus of people who had experienced the same cold front. And while none of them shouted it from the rooftops, the pattern was undeniable. Soon, that pattern would catch up with Bacall's reputation in a way that even her most devoted fans could not ignore. As the years passed and the spotlight softened on Lauren Bacall's career, something unexpected began to happen. The tightly controlled image she had spent decades perfecting started to crack, not because of scandal or media frenzy, but through the quiet honesty of time. More memoirs were published, more interviews resurfaced, and more industry veterans reflected on their experiences. The once whispered truths about Bacall became harder to ignore. James Garner's subtle warning that she was not as easy to work with as her polished reputation suggested began to ring true in more ways than anyone had anticipated. In the years after The Fan, other collaborators began to speak more openly. Directors who had once held their tongues described the challenges of working with Bacall, noting her inflexible attitude and her tendency to dominate a production. One director called her brilliant but immovable, adding that compromise was not part of her vocabulary. Even fans began to notice a shift in her tone. As Bacall grew older, her public comments about Hollywood became increasingly bitter. She criticized modern stars, dismissed new talent, and referred to herself as one of the last real actresses. While some admired her defiance, others saw something different, a refusal to adapt and a disdain for anyone who hadn't lived through her era. It wasn't just in print. During award show appearances and late career interviews, Bacall often came across as cold or dismissive, brushing off questions or correcting hosts mid-sentence. What was once seen as confidence now read as superiority, and it rubbed people the wrong way. Quietly, her mystique began to give way to a more complicated truth. And then there were the retrospectives. As film historians began to reevaluate the golden age of Hollywood, a more nuanced view of Bacall emerged. She was still celebrated. Her talent, presence, and influence were undeniable. But the image of the untouchable queen of cool was replaced by something more complicated. A woman who had fought tooth and nail for her place in the industry and, in doing so, may have lost the warmth of those around her. James Garner never gloated. He never said, "I told you so." That wasn't his style. But for those who had read between the lines of his memoir and remembered his quiet warning, the pieces began to fit. He had seen it long before others had. The emotional distance, the power plays, the subtle need to control every room she entered. In a town where reputations are everything, Garner's quiet truth stood tall against Bacall's towering myth. And what made it all the more powerful was the fact that he had nothing to gain from saying it. He wasn't chasing revenge or seeking attention. He simply couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. And now, with hindsight, people could finally see the full picture. In the end, James Garner never made a scene. He never aired his grievances on talk shows, never penned a dramatic exposé, and never tried to tarnish anyone's legacy. That wasn't who he was, but he also refused to pretend. What he experienced with Lauren Bacall left a mark, not because it was explosive or traumatic, but because it quietly exposed the cost of working alongside someone who valued control more than connection. Garner's story isn't just about one uncomfortable film set. It's about a larger truth in Hollywood. That image often shields reality, and legends are not always what they seem. For decades, Bacall's reputation as a bold, uncompromising icon went unchallenged. She was praised for her fire, her strength, and her defiance. But what was often overlooked was how that same fire could burn the people around her. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't cruel. But she was difficult, and sometimes difficult leaves scars. Garner saw it. He felt it. And instead of launching an attack, he simply chose honesty. A quiet honesty that, over time, proved to be more powerful than any headline. Maybe that's what makes this story so compelling. Not the drama, not the tension, but the fact that one of Hollywood's most likable stars saw something others chose to ignore. And instead of shouting it, he whispered, not to tear someone down, but to speak the truth because someone had to. So the next time you hear about a respected actor making a quiet comment, raising a gentle red flag, or telling a story that doesn't quite match the public narrative, ask yourself, what are they really trying to say? Because James Garner tried to warn us and nobody believed him.